Well, thank you. I think I'm in the wrong place. I know nothing about business except if you really want to lose some money, buy a vineyard. And I'll tell you about that at the end. But I do have a story to tell. And the first part of that story is the apology that I know nothing about business. But the second part, I'm not accustomed to being told by Kea Inspire what I'm to talk about. That's an unusual event for me. And what they told me was to do this. Maybe I have a flicker somewhere. I have to use the one here, I guess. This was the instructions for speakers. Prepare, not too much, say something important, say it like yourself. But it turns out, of course, Daniel Pink said that a long time ago, and most of you all know about that. So in all honesty, Kea just stole it from Daniel Pink. So the story, I guess, is how did a boy from the Antipodes end up in New York City for the last 35 years? And it's, I think, a reasonable story. I started out, my father told me, like Stephen, I guess, that I should be an engineer because I was good at science. And so I started out to be an engineer, doing engineering intermediate in Auckland. And then got the courage to tell my father, gee, I didn't really want to do that, and I thought I'd rather like to go to school in Otago. And he said, well, they have a mining school there. Why don't you go there? And I said, well, it didn't look very attractive to me. So perhaps I would go to medical school. And so, in fact, I thought, well, what the hell am I going to do with this full year of engineering intermediate, pure and applied maths, physics, and chemistry? So I thought there had to be a way to do something with that. So I went off to Otago to the medical school. And while I was at the medical school, I decided that I would finish a degree in mathematics during medical school, which was rather unusual at the time. And I say that because you're going to hear this recurring theme. Everything you do ends up learning something. It's never wasted. It's always something. Now, what I really did at the medical school, which you just heard, was I basically went there. I was a student politician. I played rugby. I got a great education, and it was free. I went on a national scholarship, and so I have an incredible amount to give back. I majored in sport and student politics, in social awareness and complete lack thereof. I never understood in the medical school why people didn't have their own tuxedos, their own dinner jackets. They always rented them. And then if you ever went to one of the medical school events in those days, you'll understand why, because once the evening was over, they weren't worth the rental. But I did begin this lifelong thought about medicine and mathematics because in those days, and even now, medicine is incredibly driven by opinion, not by science or background or data. And I began this lifelong love affair with data. What did I learn? Well, I learned no education is ever wasted. And I'm going to repeat that theme. I'm going to repeat some of the other themes of how hard it is sometimes to do things. And as a consequence, I've put together some databases. It doesn't matter what this slide says, but this is an extraordinary rare tumor. But in the last 30 years, we've looked after 10,000 patients. We know more about this disease than probably anyone in the world. And that's just by writing down the information. There's no intelligence there. It just says, record the facts going forward, and then you'll really have something to say. Well, the actual reason that I ended up in the United States was an interesting one. And the reason was that I actually did not get a Rhodes Scholarship. And that was interesting too, because I learned, what did I learn? Now here was the Governor General when I was a candidate from Otago, who told me, you know, you did remarkably well, but you didn't come first and there's only one. But what did I actually learn? Well, many of you in this room won't quite understand that in fact, the Governor General's office is a family business. And in fact, not only did Bernard Ferguson be the Governor General, his father was and his grandfather was. That seems a certain degree of nepotism, but I guess with apologies to those from the UK, it looks like we were still a colony then and you just farmed out the business of running the place. I didn't know that until I looked it up when I went to apply for the scholar. But what did I really learn? Well, what I learned actually was you should never go to an interview because it seems like a good idea at the time. I was completely unfocused. I got the nomination because I had this broad spectrum in which I was average to good in most things and excellent in none. And I went off completely unprepared. But as a consequence, I learned a great lesson. Don't go interview for a position you wouldn't take if it were offered. Now, I would have taken it. I would have ended up in the UK. But when I thought about that, I was completely underprepared. Nobody told me how to answer the question, tell me about your strengths and weaknesses. Tell me why you should get this award. And what will you do with this opportunity if given? I was never prepared. But since that day, I've always been prepared. And when I interview people now, I ask these same questions. And it's easy because if you have time to think about them, you have good answers. But if you don't take things seriously, then in fact you don't do that. There was a consolation prize, and that consolation prize has this eponymous Foreign Student Leaders Award. Extraordinary. And it was put together by the State Department, and it took 12 or 13 leaders, young people like myself, from around the Pacific to come to the United States, and that's in 1963. It was sponsored by the Department of State, and of course it was to convince us as, quote, student leaders that the Vietnam War was justifiable. Now, that was a hard challenge, and of course no award to the undeserving, as I was, comes without an agenda. So as you see some of these awards, be grateful but wary. It was all about the US policy of convincing us that the Vietnam War was appropriate. It taught me another amazing thing, though. There was 13 of us. We used to have to put on debates for or against the Vietnam War. And we'd wait and wait and wait. We went to the International Experimental Living, the Peace Corps, the University of Otago. We'd wait till the evening until we walked onto the stage, and we had little green matches and red matches, and you pulled which side you were for or against. And I could terrorize being for and terrorize being against. And when I came back to New Zealand, I realized I didn't know what the hell I thought. I could make a great argument for both sides, but I learned that that didn't form your opinions. So when I came back, I realized I had an education, but I didn't really know anything. I really didn't know anything. I had a wonderful introduction to life, but I didn't know anything, and so I had to do some work. I had to turn this medical license to do harm to people into something that would make a difference, and so I began. Now, serendipity always helps. This gentleman on the left, Francis Moore, was the chairman at the Harvard Medical School. I wanted to go work with him. He truly was famous. He was on the front page of Time magazine as the surgeon. And he offered me an opportunity, and I said, Dr. Moore, have you ever had anyone from New Zealand before? And he said, no, depends on you if we ever have another one. If you want to get someone's attention, that'll do it. But what I also learned was that this was about work. And I don't apologize for this, but in those days, the reason you worked the kind of hours you did was because there was 100 other people who would take your job if you didn't want it. In fact, those of you who have read Malcolm Gladwell's book, this is applicable to surgeons too. Researchers have settled on what they believe is the magic number for true expertise, whether you're a violinist or a football player or a scientist, 10,000 hours. And those who've enjoyed the book will understand that. Now, the way that was done at Boston was we worked 5 years, 100 plus hours a week. We slept in the hospital every second night for 5 years. And if you think about that, 5 years of 100 hours a week, that sounds like the 5,000 are done in 1 year. 5 years would be 25,000. But of course, it was only 20% efficient because you did a hell of a lot of what we called scut work. So I finished 5 years there, and I only had 5,000 to go. And so then I had to really focus on doing something worthwhile. Now, one of the ways you do that is, of course, is to identify a mentor, someone who will actually you come with or you'll get. And it always surprises me how few people know who or what mentor was. Many of you with the broad education I got knew who mentor was. Most of my American fellows and residents have no idea who mentor was. And of course, mentor was the advisor to Telemachus, the person supposed to look after Odysseus' son, Telemachus. But of course, for the woman in the room, you all know that it was Pallas Athena who actually assumed the body of Mentor. Imagine, no disrespect, making a woman the goddess of war and wisdom. What combination does that do? It's certainly a lot more than Mentor. Mentor was rather a clown. He was actually, if you go back and read the original, read Homer, Mentor completely failed. He was an old friend of Odysseus's, and he had entrusted his son and his household, and of course, Odysseus comes home, high time too. He's killed the rogues who turned his house inside out, ate up his wealth, and bullied his son. That doesn't sound like what we think as Mentor. So then you have to think about, where did this word come from? What happened? Well, of course, it was a popular novel written by a Frenchman in the 17th century who made up this story of the adventures of Telemachus. And that's where the generation of what makes a mentor came about. It was this concept of taking a young person and growing them to adulthood. So the message is, again, you want to know about the truth, go back to the original source and tell your children. Now, once you've been mentored, you are the mentee, as I was by Dr. Moore, and became a friend of his, rather remarkably, a man who influenced me more than anyone other than my father. But then you've got to become a mentee. And one of the problems about mentoring people is people forget that it's supposed to be about the mentee. So the next lesson is, it's not about you. It's about what you do for other people. So I went to the National Institute of Health. I had to prove myself. I then had to take a serious leadership position, and that's what I did at Memorial Sloan Kettering, where I stayed. A remarkable place. Sloan and Kettering were both chairmen of General Motors. They endowed the Research Institute. It's the biggest cancer hospital in the world. It has an endowment of about $3.5 billion. It's been a staggeringly good place to work. But vision is not one event. Vision is really a mosaic. And we forget that vision is a mosaic. And we forget that your mosaic is not my mosaic. The pieces in my vision are not the pieces in your vision, nor should they be. Now, what do I think is important? Well, what actually is success? Is it recognition, admiration, money, fame, notoriety? Probably none of the above. They all have a little bit, perhaps, that influence you. But success for each individual is very different. I think success, rather selfishly, is personal self-fulfillment. Believing that you actually are doing something worthwhile. Believing that you are actually making a difference by making other people better. The ultimate accolade is that you make everybody else look better than you. You challenge everybody that works for you. Well, you'd like to. I wanted to hire every single person in the department that was smarter than I was. I just didn't want them to know. And if you do that, I think it makes a lot of difference. And that's what it means. It's about the journey, not the destination. It's about waking up every day and looking at the mistakes you'll make today on the grounds that they'll make you more successful the next day. And if you do that, you never get tired. Someone said, Dr. Brennan, when are you going to retire? I said, what do you mean? I can't possibly have retirement interfere with my work. How do you motivate people? Well, this is the way I motivated myself. Constant dissatisfaction with the status quo. If you're uncomfortable about the status quo, then you'll make a difference. You heard that from Kim. There's a little bit of a sense that maybe in New Zealand we're too fortunate, we're too lucky, it's too easy. So you have to foster this little chronic disconnect, this chronic discontent to make a difference. Now, there's nothing novel about that idea. I wasn't the first person to think of that, God knows. This gentleman, John Hunter, was a surgeon in the 18th century. Surgery is like an armed savage who attempts to get that by force, which a civilized man would get by stratagem. And I've spent my life doing that. And it's hard to think about the concept that you would take a very sharp instrument and make, if you're not involved in robotic surgery, a very long, large incision in someone as if it was what you did every day, which is what I did every day. But unless that on the other end of that knife or the other end of the robot there's some empathy, it won't work. That's not what looking after people means. Now, finally, I was instructed to say something important. Not sure what I'd like to say. But these are the couple that I came with that allow you to grow. And that's this concept, that constant acquisition to the tools to grow. You come in a fellowship in my department, my program, I say to the fellows, you know, my job, this is not a finishing school. And it's incredibly competitive to get in. This is a school in which you have 2 years. The first year we'll tell you what we think you should know. And then you have to tell us what are the tools you need to grow. And our job is to deliver them. And that's quite hard. Most of us know what makes us unhappy. Very few of us know what makes us happy. Many people would say, being with my children makes me happy. Well, that's true for me too. But being with any one of them for 24 hours, I'd commit suicide. So it's this constant idea that you're acquiring tools. What is the most rewarding? Well, genuinely the most rewarding is the privilege, the gift of looking after another human being in an empathetic way. Because if you're just a technical surgeon and just take that knife and slash and burn, then you won't survive. And if you do that, as I have, only for cancer patients, then you become a rather crass and ugly person. But if you do it with sensitivity, knowing for the cancer patient, you won't cure everybody. But you will help them to survive this devastating illness. And then, of course, if you constantly, as you heard from other speakers, do it in a way it's not about you. It's about the next generation. It's about what you do for the next generation. And you'll always be rewarded by that. But many people don't think about it. The me generation is a failure. We have to think about the generation in which we invest in allowing other people to grow. And so it's not about you. And then finally, for those a little more senior, it's time to give back. We've made a considerable effort in the US because there is a gifting of looking for alumni from Otago to actually give back, to actually give some money back, to give some educational opportunities back, to be here today because it's important. I was supposed to be in Wellington yesterday. I now know more about the Queenstown Airport than I ever wished to know. So what have I done to give back beside that to the university? Well, then he took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him as king, and offered him a sacrifice on the city wall. My son, Sean, that you heard about, was born in Boston, grew up in New York, went to school in California and Australia, and is now making wine in the Gibbston Valley. So I think I've more than given back. As Kim reminded you, of course, if you want to be a wannabe winemaker and you want to make $1 million, you certainly should start with 2 or 3. And so here we are in a beautiful, beautiful part of the world, making the world's best red. That's pretty good. I think I've given back. So thank you very much.